My name is Clara, and I'm 65 years old. I never thought I'd be sitting here speaking to you like this, baring my heart to strangers across a screen. But there's a story inside me that's been clawing its way out, a story I need to tell, not for pity, but because I've learned something I wish I'd known decades ago. It began the day my daughter-in-law Emily looked me in the eye and said, "Clara, you're not welcome at the baby shower. You'll embarrass us with your old-fashioned ways." Those words cut deeper than any knife, not because they were cruel, but because my own son, Michael, stood beside her, his silence louder than her voice. That was the moment I realized I'd become invisible to the family I'd built with my own hands, my own heart, my own sacrifices. I was born in a small town, the kind where everyone knew your name and your business. My parents were simple people, my father a carpenter, my mother a seamstress. They taught me that family was everything that you poured your soul into those you loved, even when it left you empty. I carried that lesson into my marriage to Tom, a quiet man with a laugh that could light up a room. We had Michael, our only child, and I thought my life was complete. I was a homemaker, a mother, a wife roles I wore like badges of honor. I baked cookies for school fundraisers, sewed Halloween costumes, and sat up late with Michael when he was sick, whispering stories until he fell asleep. When Tom passed 10 years ago, a piece of me went with him, but I told myself I still had Michael. I still had family. Michael met Emily in college, and I loved her like my own daughter. She was bright, ambitious, with a smile that made you feel like you mattered. I welcomed her into our home-shared recipes and listened to her dreams. When they married, I gave them the down payment for their house, a gift from the savings Tom and I had scraped together over decades. I wanted them to have a start to build something solid. And when Emily got pregnant with their first child, my heart swelled. A grandchild, a new chapter. I started knitting a blanket pale blue with tiny stars, pouring my hopes into every stitch. But something shifted after Tom died. I noticed it in small ways at first, Michael calling less, Emily brushing off my suggestions about the nursery. I told myself it was normal that young couples need space. But then came the comments. "Clara, you don't understand how things work," now Emily would say when I offered to host a family dinner. Or Michael with a sigh. "Mom, you don't need to keep coming over. We're fine." I felt like a guest in their lives, tolerated but not wanted. Still, I kept showing up, bringing casseroles, offering to babysit, hoping they'd see I was still useful, still theirs. The baby shower was Emily's idea, a big event at a fancy venue downtown. I was thrilled when she asked me to help plan it. I spent weeks suggesting ideas, homemade centerpieces, a slideshow of family photos games I'd played at my own shower years ago. Emily nodded politely, but I could see her eyes glaze over. One day, she called me. "Clara," she said, her voice clipped. "We've decided to keep the shower small, just our friends and a few relatives. You don't need to come." I laughed, thinking it was a mistake. "Emily, I'm the grandmother. Of course I'm coming." That's when she said it, her words sharp and final. "You'll embarrass us with your old-fashioned ways." I waited for Michael to speak up to defend me, but he just muttered, "Mom, it's her day. Let it go. Let it." I stood in my kitchen, the phone still in my hand, feeling the world tilt. Embarrass them, me, with my knitted blankets and my stories of Tom? Me who'd given them everything I wanted, to scream, to demand an explanation. But all I could do was hang up. I sat at the table staring at the blue blanket I'd been knitting and cried. Not loud sobs, but the quiet kind that come when you realize you've lost something you can't name. I'd spent my life building a family, and now they'd locked the door and left me outside. The days that followed were a blur of silence. I didn't call Michael or Emily. I didn't want to beg for their love, but the hurt grew heavy and unrelenting, like a stone in my chest. I stopped going to the knitting group I'd joined after Tom's death. I stopped answering calls from friends. I'd always been the one to hold everyone together, but now I was unraveling and no one noticed. I kept picturing the baby shower, Emily laughing with her friends, Michael beaming, everyone celebrating a new life, while I sat alone, erased from the story. One morning, I walked past the mirror in my hallway and caught my reflection. My hair was gray, my face lined with years of worry and joy. I looked old. Was that what they saw? An old woman out of touch, a relic to be tucked away. I touched the locket around my neck, a gift from my mother when I married Tom. Inside was a tiny photo of her smiling strong. She'd faced her own betrayals, my father's drinking, my brother's distance, but she'd never let them break her. Clara, she'd say, your heart is your own. Don't let anyone steal it. I hadn't thought of those words in years, but they came back to me now, sharp and clear. I made a cup of tea and sat on my porch, the locket warm against my skin. For the first time in weeks, I let myself think about what I wanted, not what they needed. I'd spent my life giving my time, my money, my love. I'd given so much that I'd forgotten who I was without them. But I wasn't just Michael's mother or Emily's mother-in-law. I was Clara, a woman who'd survived loss, who'd built a life from scratch, who'd loved fiercely even when it hurt. And I wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I called my old friend Ruth. We'd been close in our 20s, raising kids together, sharing secrets over coffee. Life had pulled us apart, but she answered on the first ring, her voice warm and familiar. Clara, where have you been? I've missed you. I told her everything, the baby shower, Emily's words, Michael's silence. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, Clara, you're not invisible. You're just surrounded by people too foolish to see you. Her words were a lifeline pulling me back to myself. Ruth invited me to her book club that weekend. I almost said no, but something in her voice, kind but firm, made me agree. The group was small, 6 women in their 60s and 70s, gathered in Ruth's cozy living room. They were strangers, but they welcomed me like an old friend. We talked about the book then, about life, our children, our losses, our regrets. One woman, Helen, shared how her daughter had stopped speaking to her after a fight over money. Another, Diane, admitted she felt like a burden to her son's family. I realized I wasn't alone. These women with their gray hair and quiet strength were carrying the same wounds, the same questions. Had we given too much? Had we loved too hard? I started going to the book club every week. It was a small thing, but it felt like a rebellion. I was choosing myself, even if just for a few hours. I began to notice other small ways I could reclaim my life. I tidied my house, not for visitors, but for me. I planted herbs in my garden, their scent filling the air as I worked. I even pulled out Tom's old records and played them late at night, swaying to the music in my living room. These weren't grand gestures, but they were mine, and they reminded me I was still here, still alive. One day, while sorting through old papers, I found a document I'd almost forgotten about the trust fund I'd set up for Emily. After Tom died, I'd wanted to secure her and Michael's future, so I'd poured my life savings, every penny from our savings account, the sale of Tom's car, even the insurance payout, into a trust for her. It was a gift, a way to show her she was family. The fund was worth nearly $200,000, enough to pay off their mortgage or start a business. I'd never told them the full amount, only that it was there for someday. But I was still the trustee, the one who controlled it. I sat with that document for hours, my tea growing cold. I thought about Emily's words, Michael's silence, the baby shower I wasn't allowed to attend. I thought about all the years I'd given them, all the pieces of myself I'd carved away to make them happy. And I realized something: I didn't owe them my future. I didn't owe them my worth. The realization that I didn't owe them my future settled over me like a quiet dawn, soft but unshakable. I sat there, the trust fund papers spread across my kitchen table, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of power. Not the loud, vengeful kind, but the steady strength of a woman who knows her own worth. I didn't decide what to do with the trust fund that night. I wasn't ready. Instead, I folded the papers, carefully tucked them into a drawer, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind churned with memories, each one a thread in the tapestry of my life, and I wondered how I'd let those threads slip through my fingers. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my window. It was the kind of gray, gentle rain that makes you want to stay inside with a book and a blanket. I made coffee strong and black the way Tom used to like it and sat on my porch watching the world soften under the downpour. I thought about my mother, her locket still hanging around my neck. She'd faced her own storms. My father's drinking had left her to raise me and my brother alone for years, yet she never let bitterness take root. Clara, she'd say you can't control what others do, but you can control what you carry. I'd carried so much for Michael and Emily, their dreams, their needs, their happiness. But what was I carrying for myself? I started small because small was all I could manage. I called Ruth and asked if she wanted to meet for lunch. She suggested a little cafe downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus. When I arrived, she was already there, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her eyes crinkling with a smile. Over sandwiches and iced tea, we talked about everything and nothing, old movies our kids, the way the world had changed. I told her about the trust fund, my voice low as if saying it out loud might break some unspoken rule. Ruth listened, her face calm but thoughtful. Clara, she said that money is yours. You gave it with love, but love doesn't mean you owe them forever. What do you want to do with it? I didn't have an answer, not yet, but her question stayed with me like a seed planted in soft earth. I started spending more time with Ruth and the book club women. They became my anchor, a circle of voices that reminded me I wasn't alone. Helen, the one whose daughter had cut her off, invited me to her art class. I hadn't painted since high school, but I went feeling awkward with a brush in my hand. The teacher, a young woman with bright eyes, told us to paint something that made us feel alive. I painted a garden wild and full of color, the kind I'd always dreamed of having. When I finished, Helen squeezed my hand. "That's you, Clara," she said. "Still growing, still blooming." Those small moments, lunch with Ruth, painting with Helen, laughing over wine at book club, began to stitch me back together. I started to see myself differently, not as a mother who'd been discarded, but as a woman with a life still worth living. I took walks in the park, noticing the way the leaves changed with the season, their edges turning gold and crimson. I bought a new dress, deep blue, not because anyone would see me in it, but because it made me feel like myself again. I even started writing in a journal, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. The pages filled with my thoughts, my hurts, my hopes. I wrote about Tom, about the way he'd hold my hand during thunderstorms. I wrote about Michael, about the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. And I wrote about Emily, her sharp words still echoing in my heart. One evening, while flipping through my journal, I found a line I'd written weeks ago. I gave them everything, but they didn't want me. It stung to read, but it also sparked something. I thought about the trust fund again, that pile of money I'd poured my life into. It wasn't just money, it was my years of sacrifice, my nights worrying about bills, my dreams deferred so Michael and Emily could have theirs. And they'd taken it for granted, just like they'd taken me. I didn't want revenge, not the way people think of it with shouting and tears. I wanted justice, the quiet kind that comes from standing up for yourself when no one else will. I called my lawyer the next day. His name was David, a kind man in his 50s, who'd handled Tom's estate after he passed. I told him I wanted to review the trust fund to understand my options. He invited me to his office, a small space filled with books and family photos. Over coffee, he explained that, as the trustee, I had full control. I could dissolve the fund, redirect the money, or keep it as it was. "Clara," he said, "this is your decision. What do you want?" There was that question again, the one Ruth had asked, the one I was starting to ask myself. I spent the next week thinking it over. I walked through my house, touching the things that mattered, the quilt my mother made, Tom's old radio, the locket I never took off. I thought about the women at book club, their stories of being overlooked, of fighting to be seen. I thought about the baby shower, the one I wasn't allowed to attend, and the way Emily's words had made me feel small. And I thought about the future, not Michael's or Emily's, but mine. What did I want? I wanted to feel whole again. I wanted to honor the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. One morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I called David and told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to dissolve the trust fund and redirect the money to a charity, one that supported elderly women. Women like me, like Ruth, like Helen, who'd given their lives to others and been left behind. David didn't question me. He drafted the papers, his voice steady as he explained each step. "This is a big decision, Clara," he said. "Are you sure?" I looked at him. My hands folded in my lap and nodded. I've never been more sure. The day of the baby shower came a bright Saturday in spring. I didn't go, of course. I didn't call or send a gift. Instead, I sat in my garden sipping tea, the legal notice from David sitting on the table beside me. It was done. The trust fund was gone, its $200,000 now pledged to a charity called Silver Years, a place that offered housing counseling and community for women over 60. I'd asked David to send Emily and Michael a letter informing them of the change. It was polite, professional, no accusations or anger. Just the facts: the fund was dissolved, the money redirected. I didn't need to say more. They'd know why. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Emily, her voice high and frantic. "Clara, what is this? You can't do this. That money was for us." I listened, my heart steady, as she rambled about their plans, their dreams, how they'd counted on it. Michael got on the line, his tone softer but pleading. "Mom, please, let's talk about this. We didn't mean to hurt you." I didn't argue or explain. I just said, "The decision is made," and hung up. I turned off my phone and went back to my tea, the garden quiet around me. I wish I could say I felt triumph, but it wasn't that simple. There was a sadness, a grief for the family I'd thought we were. But there was also a lightness, a sense of release. I'd given them so much, but I didn't owe them my soul. I'd chosen myself not out of spite, but out of love for the woman I was, for the life I still had left to live. Ruth came over that evening bringing a bottle of wine and a plate of her famous lemon bars. We sat on my porch watching the sunset, and I told her what I'd done. She didn't cheer or clap. She just took my hand and said, "Clara, you're stronger than you know." We talked late into the night about our pasts, our hopes, the women we'd become. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged not to a family that didn't want me, but to myself. The days after the baby shower felt like stepping into a new world, one where the air was sharper, the colors brighter. I'd expected to feel guilt, maybe even regret after dissolving the trust fund, but instead I felt a quiet steadiness, like a tree that's weathered a storm and found its roots still deep in the earth. I didn't hate Emily or Michael. I didn't even want them to suffer. But I'd drawn a line, one that said, my heart wasn't theirs to trample anymore. And in that line, I found a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I'd make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the world come alive, birds flitting through the trees, the neighbor's cat prowling the fence. I began to notice small things I'd overlooked in my haze of hurt, the way the morning light slanted across my kitchen, the scent of lavender from the garden I'd started tending again. My house, once a shrine to memories of Tom and Michael, became mine again. I rearranged the furniture, hung new curtains, and placed a vase of wildflowers on the table. These were small acts, but they felt like declarations I was here and I was enough. Ruth and the book club women became my lifeline. We met every Wednesday, but it wasn't just about books anymore. It was about us, our stories, our scars, our quiet victories. Diane, the one who felt like a burden to her son, told us she'd started volunteering at a local shelter, finding purpose in helping others. Helen shared that she'd sold her first painting, a vibrant landscape that caught the eye of a gallery owner. Their courage inspired me, made me want to keep growing even when it scared me. One evening, Ruth suggested we take a trip together, just the 6 of us. Somewhere warm, she said, her eyes twinkling. a place where we can laugh and forget the world for a while. The idea felt extravagant, almost reckless, but I said yes. For the first time in years, I wanted to say yes to something. I started thinking about money too, not in the desperate way I had when Tom was sick, but in a practical, deliberate way. The trust fund was gone, but I still had my savings modest, but enough to live on if I was careful. I'd always been frugal saving for Michael, for Emily, for a future that wasn't mine. Now I asked myself what I wanted. I met with David, my lawyer, to go over my finances. He was kind, patient, walking me through numbers I'd never paid much attention to. Clara, he said, you've got options. You could travel, move somewhere new, even invest in something for yourself. The word options felt foreign, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak, but it also felt like a door cracking open. One option I hadn't considered came from an unexpected place. At book club, Helen mentioned a community center that was looking for volunteers to teach classes for seniors. You'd be perfect, Clara, she said. You've got so much to share, your knitting, your stories, your heart. I laughed it off at first. Me, a teacher, I'd spent my life raising a family, not standing in front of a room, but the idea stayed with me, nagging like a song you can't forget. A week later, I called the center and offered to teach a knitting class. They were thrilled, saying they'd had trouble finding volunteers. I felt a spark of pride, something I hadn't felt in years. The first class was terrifying. I stood in a small room with 10 women, most of them my age or older, their eyes curious but kind. My hands shook as I held up a ball of yarn explaining how to cast on. But as I talked, something shifted. I told them about the blanket I'd knitted for my grandchild, about the way each stitch held a piece of my love. They nodded, some sharing their own stories of grandchildren they rarely saw, of lives they'd poured into others. By the end of the class, we were laughing, swapping tips, planning to meet again. I walked home that night feeling taller, as if I'd reclaimed a piece of myself I didn't know I'd lost. Teaching became my rhythm. Twice a week, I'd go to the center, my bag full of yarn and needles, my heart full of something new. The women in my class became friends. Their names: Margaret, Lila, Joan. Etched in my mind like family, they'd bring me cookies, tell me about their lives, ask for advice. I wasn't just teaching them to knit. I was building something, a community where we all mattered. One day, Margaret, a quiet woman with soft white hair, gave me a card. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you, Clara, for reminding me I'm still here." I cried when I read it, not out of sadness, but because I'd given her something I was only just learning to give myself. I didn't hear from Emily or Michael for weeks after the baby shower. Their silence was loud, but it didn't break me. I'd expected them to call again to plead or argue, but they didn't. Part of me wondered if they were ashamed. Another part wondered if they just didn't care. Either way, I didn't chase them. I'd spent too many years chasing love that wasn't mine to beg for. Instead, I focused on my life, my garden, my classes, my friends. I started painting again, joining Helen's art class, letting colors spill across the canvas without worrying if they were right. I even booked that trip with the book club women, a week in Charleston, where we'd walk cobblestone streets and eat seafood by the water. I was living, not just surviving, and it felt like a miracle. But life has a way of pulling you back to the past, even when you're ready to let it go. One evening, as I was watering my herbs, a car pulled into my driveway. It was Michael. He stepped out, his face tired, his shoulders slumped. I hadn't seen him in months, and the sight of him, my boy now a man with lines around his eyes, made my heart ache. I wanted to run to him, to hold him like I did when he was small, but I stayed where I was, my watering can steady in my hands. "Mom," he said, his voice soft, "can we talk?" I invited him inside, not because I owed him, but because I wanted to hear what he had to say. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd cried after Emily's call. He looked around, noticing the changes, the new curtains, the wildflowers, the painting I'd hung on the wall. "It looks different," he said, almost to himself. I nodded, waiting. He took a deep breath and started talking. He said he was sorry that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that the baby shower had been Emily's idea, and he'd gone along to keep the peace. I didn't know how to stand up to her. He admitted, his eyes on the table. I didn't know how to stand up for you. His words were a balm and a blade. I'd waited so long to hear them, but they didn't erase the months of silence the way he'd let me fade from his life. I asked him why he was here now. He hesitated, then said, Emily's upset about the trust fund. She's been struggling since it was gone. We were counting on it, Mom. I know we messed up, but can't you reconsider? I looked at him, my son, the boy I'd raised, the man who'd chosen his wife over his mother. I didn't feel anger, only a deep, quiet sadness. Michael, I said that money was my life. I gave it to you and Emily because I loved you. But love isn't a debt you can collect. I gave you everything and you sent me away. I had to choose myself. He didn't argue. He just sat there, his hands clasped, his eyes wet. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it would be okay, but I didn't. I'd spent too many years softening the world for him. Instead, I offered him tea, and we sat in silence, the weight of our choices between us. When he left, he hugged me, his arms tight but brief. I love you, Mom, he said. I nodded, but I didn't say it back. Not because I didn't love him, I always would, but because I was learning to love myself, too. That night, I wrote in my journal, I am not invisible. I am Clara, and I am enough. I closed the book, touched the locket around my neck, and went to bed. The rain had stopped, and the stars were out bright against the dark. I fell asleep feeling whole, not because my family had come back, but because I'd found my way back to myself. The morning after Michael's visit, I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. His words, his apology, his plea for the trust fund. They lingered like a fog, clouding the clarity I'd fought so hard to find. I made my usual coffee, sat by the window, but the routine felt different, as if his presence had stirred something I'd buried. I didn't regret dissolving the trust fund. I didn't even regret the silence I'd given him instead of forgiveness. But he was my son, and no amount of strength could erase the ache of loving someone who'd hurt you. I touched the locket around my neck, my mother's face smiling inside, and whispered, Mama, what would you have done? She didn't answer, of course, but the weight of her strength steadied me. I decided to keep moving because stopping would let the fog settle. I went to the community center for my knitting class, my bag slung over my shoulder, my heart still tender. The women were already there, their chatter filling the room like sunlight. Margaret had brought a new pattern Lila was teasing Joan about her tangled yarn, and they all greeted me with smiles that felt like home. I didn't tell them about Michael's visit, not yet, but their presence was enough to remind me I wasn't alone. We knitted and talked, and for those 2 hours I was just Clara, the woman who taught them to make stars with yarn, not the mother wrestling with her son's choices. After class, I stayed to help clean up stacking chairs and sweeping stray bits of thread. The center's director, a warm woman named Susan, stopped by to thank me. Clara, she said, you've brought something special to this place. The women talk about you all the time. Her words caught me off guard, a small gift I hadn't expected. I thanked her, my voice quiet, and she hesitated before adding, we're starting a new program, storytelling workshops for seniors. I think you'd be a natural. Would you consider leading one? I blinked, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. Knitting was one thing, tangible, familiar, but storytelling. That was bearing your soul. I told her I'd think about it, but as I walked home, the idea took root like a seed I hadn't meant to plant. That evening, I pulled out my journal and started writing not about Michael or the trust fund, but about my life. I wrote about my childhood running through fields with my brother, my mother's hands sewing late into the night. I wrote about Tom, the way he'd proposed with a daisy because he couldn't afford a ring. I wrote about Michael's first steps, his laughter, the way he'd clung to me during thunderstorms. The words poured out raw and unpolished, but they felt true. I realized I had stories to tell, not just the painful ones, but the ones that made me who I was. Maybe Susan was right. Maybe I could share them. The next week, I told Susan I'd lead the storytelling workshop. She beamed, handing me a flyer with my name on it. Clara's Stories, A Journey Through Life. Seeing it in print made my stomach flutter, but it also made me proud. I spent days preparing, jotting down ideas, practicing in front of my mirror. The workshop was small, just 8 people, but when the day came, I felt like I was stepping onto a stage. I wore my blue dress, the one I'd bought for myself, and the locket, my mother's strength, close to my heart. I told them about my mother, about the locket, about the lessons she'd taught me. I didn't talk about Michael or Emily. I wasn't ready, but I shared pieces of my heart, and they listened, their eyes soft with understanding. One man, George, a widower with a gentle voice, shared a story about his wife, how they danced in their kitchen every Sunday. A woman named Rose talked about her childhood in a tiny apartment, her dreams of being a singer. Each story was a thread weaving us together, and by the end we were more than strangers. I went home that night feeling full not of food or wine, but of connection. I'd given something and I'd received something back. It was a quiet power, one I was only beginning to understand. My days took on a new rhythm. I taught knitting twice a week, led the storytelling workshop once a month, and spent time with Ruth and the book club women. We were planning our Charleston trip, flipping through brochures, laughing about packing too many shoes. I started saving for it, setting aside small amounts from my pension, treating it like a promise to myself. I also met with David again, not about the trust fund, but about my future. I wanted to sell my house, not right away, but someday. It was too big for me now, filled with echoes of a life that wasn't mine anymore. David suggested a condo, something smaller, closer to town. The idea excited me, a fresh start I hadn't thought I'd want. I began sorting through my belongings, deciding what to keep, what to let go. I found a box of Michael's old things, school projects, a baseball glove, a photo of us at the zoo when he was 6. I sat on the floor holding that photo, my heart twisting. I didn't hate him, but I didn't know how to love him without losing myself again. I put the photo back, not ready to decide its place in my life. But I kept the locket out, wearing it every day, a reminder of my mother's words, "Your heart is your own." One afternoon, Ruth invited me to a fundraiser for Silver Years, the charity I'd given the trust fund to. I hadn't planned to go donating. The money had been enough, but Ruth insisted, saying it would be good for me to see where it went. The event was held at a community hall decorated with fairy lights and flowers. I wore a simple dress, my locket gleaming against it, and stood with Ruth as the director spoke about the charity's work housing for elderly women's support groups' art classes. She mentioned an anonymous donor who'd given a transformative gift, and my cheeks warmed. Ruth squeezed my arm, her eyes knowing. I met women there, women like me, who'd been overlooked, forgotten, but were finding their way back. One named Evelyn told me she'd moved into a Silver Years apartment after her children stopped calling. This place gave me a home. She said, her voice steady. It gave me hope. I listened, my throat tight, realizing my choice had rippled beyond Emily and Michael. It had touched lives I'd never know, and that felt like a kind of justice, too. When I got home, there was a letter in my mailbox, no return address. I opened it, my hand steady, and found Emily's handwriting. It was short. Not an apology, but a request to meet. "Clara," she wrote, "I want to talk. Please." I set the letter down, my heart, calm but guarded. I didn't owe her a response, but I didn't hate her either. I'd loved her once like a daughter, and part of me always would. But love didn't mean surrender. I tucked the letter into a drawer next to the trust fund papers and went to my garden. The herbs were thriving, their scent filling the air, and I knelt to pull a weed, the earth cool under my fingers. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I am not what they took from me. I am what I choose to become." I closed the book, touched the locket, and looked out my window. The stars were bright, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I was Clara, and I was building a life not for anyone else, but for me. Emily's letter sat in that drawer for days, its presence like a shadow I could feel, but didn't want to face. I wasn't angry, not anymore, but I wasn't ready to open that door either. I'd spent so long chasing her approval, Michael's love, their acceptance, that I'd forgotten how to stand still and let them come to me or not. So I left the letter where it was tucked beside the trust fund papers and focused on the life I was building. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. The storytelling workshop became my sanctuary. Every month I'd stand in that small room at the community center, my voice steadier with each session, sharing pieces of my life and listening to others share theirs. George the widower told us about his first date with his wife, how he'd spilled coffee on his shirt, and she'd laughed, saying it made him human. Rose sang for us one day, her voice trembling, but beautiful, a lullaby she'd written for a child she'd lost. Each story was a gift, a reminder that we were all more than our losses. I started bringing my journal to the sessions, reading from it sometimes, not the painful parts, but the ones that felt like light memories of Tom, teaching me to dance, of my mother's hands braiding my hair. The group listened, their eyes soft, and I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. One evening, after a particularly moving session where Rose cried while sharing her story, George lingered as the others left. He was tall, with kind eyes and hands that moved slowly, as if they remembered every task they'd ever done. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you've got a way of making people feel safe. I haven't talked about my wife like this since she passed. Thank you." His words landed softly like a pebble in still water rippling through me. I thanked him, my cheeks warm, and we stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable. He didn't ask me out, and I didn't want him to, but his kindness reminded me that connection was still possible even now, even after everything. I was changing not in loud ways, but in the quiet choices I made. I sold Tom's old car, a rusty sedan I'd kept for sentiment, and used the money to buy a bicycle. It was a small thing, but riding it through the park, the wind in my hair, made me feel young again, free. I started cooking for myself, not just heating leftovers, but trying recipes I'd clipped from magazines: roasted chicken with herbs, a peach cobbler that filled the house with sweetness. I ate at the table, not the couch, with a candle lit because I deserved it. These weren't grand gestures, but they were mine, and they built a life I was proud of. The Charleston trip with the book club women was coming up, and we met at Ruth's house to plan. We spread maps and brochures across her table, laughing about who'd bring the best snacks. Helen wanted to visit art galleries, Diane was set on ghost tours, and I just wanted to walk by the ocean, feel the sand under my feet. We booked a house by the beach, nothing fancy but ours, for a week. I saved for it, carefully tucking away bits of my pension, and when I sent the deposit, I felt a thrill, like I was claiming a piece of the world for myself. I also started looking at condos, not seriously, but enough to imagine a new chapter. David sent me listings, small places with balconies and big windows close to the community center and Ruth's house. I visited one on a whim, a cozy unit with a view of the park. The realtor, a young woman with a bright smile, showed me the kitchen, the bedroom, the little nook, perfect for a reading chair. I didn't buy it, but standing there, I could see myself in it, my books on the shelves, my paintings on the walls, my life, not someone else's. It was a possibility, and that was enough. One morning, as I was watering my garden, the phone rang. I expected Ruth or one of the knitting women, but it was Emily. Her voice was different, not frantic like before, but soft, almost broken. "Clara," she said, "can we meet? I need to talk to you, please." I stood there, the watering can heavy in my hand, my heart steady but cautious. I didn't say yes right away. I asked her why, what she wanted. She hesitated, then said, "I want to make things right. I had the baby Clara, a girl. I want you to meet her." The words hit me like a wave, not because of the baby I'd known she was coming, but because of what they carried. Emily was reaching out, not for money, but for something else. I told her I'd think about it and hung up my hands, trembling. I didn't tell anyone about the call, not even Ruth. I needed to sit with it to understand what I felt. I went to the community center that afternoon, taught my knitting class, and smiled through it, but my mind was elsewhere. After class, I stayed late, sitting in the empty room, my journal open in my lap. I wrote about the baby, about Emily's voice, about the part of me that wanted to run to them, and the part that wanted to stay right here, safe in the life I'd built. I didn't owe them a meeting, but I wondered if I owed myself the chance to see what they wanted to close that chapter, or maybe write a new one. The next day, I called Emily back. I agreed to meet, but on my terms at a cafe near my house, not theirs. She sounded relieved, almost tearful, and said she'd bring the baby. I didn't ask about Michael, and she didn't mention him. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of calm and nerves, like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you could step back or leap. I chose a day later that week, giving myself time to prepare not just for Emily, but for myself. The meeting was set for a Thursday, and the days leading up to it were a blur of routine and reflection. I taught my classes, rode my bike, tended my garden. I wore the locket every day, its weight a reminder of my mother's strength, my own. I didn't know what Emily would say or what I'd feel when I saw the baby, but I knew I wasn't the same Clara who'd cried in her kitchen months ago. I was stronger not because I'd hardened, but because I'd learned to hold my own heart. Thursday came bright and warm. I walked to the cafe, my blue dress swaying, the locket gleaming. Emily was already there, sitting outside a stroller beside her. She looked tired, her hair pulled back, her eyes searching mine as I approached. The baby was asleep, a tiny bundle with soft cheeks and a wisp of dark hair. I sat across from Emily, my hands folded, and waited. She started talking, her voice low, saying she was sorry that she'd been wrong to ban me from the shower, that she'd been caught up in her own world. "I didn't see you, Clara," she said, tears in her eyes. "I didn't see how much you'd given us." I listened, not interrupting, letting her words settle. She talked about the baby named Lily, about how motherhood had changed her, made her see things differently. She didn't ask for the trust fund back, didn't mention money at all. Instead, she asked if I'd be part of Lily's life, if we could start again. I looked at the baby, her tiny chest rising and falling, and felt a pull, not just for her, but for the family I'd once dreamed of. But I also felt the weight of my own worth, the life I'd built without them. I didn't give her an answer right away. I told her I needed time, that trust wasn't rebuilt in a single conversation. She nodded, her face open, and I saw something I hadn't before: vulnerability, not just manipulation. I reached out and touched Lily's hand, her fingers curling around mine, and my heart softened, but not enough to forget. We parted with a promise to talk again. No commitments, just a door left ajar. I walked home, the sun warm on my face, and felt a quiet pride. I hadn't run to them, hadn't surrendered. I'd stood in my truth, and that was enough. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I am Clara, and I choose my path." I closed the book, touched the locket, and looked out at the stars. They were bright, and so was I. The meeting with Emily left me in a strange liminal space, like standing on a bridge between two worlds. I didn't feel the rush of reconciliation or the sting of rejection, just a quiet, open-ended calm. Lily's tiny hand curling around my finger stayed with me, a soft weight in my heart. But so did the memory of Emily's words at the baby's shower. Michael's silence, the months I'd spent rebuilding myself from their absence. I wasn't ready to step fully into their lives again, nor was I ready to close the door forever. So I let it be, trusting that time would show me the way. For now I had my own life to live, and I was determined to keep building it. The Charleston trip with the book club women was a turning point. We arrived in early summer, the air thick with salt and jasmine, the streets alive with color. Our rented house was a weathered cottage by the beach with creaky floors and a porch that caught the ocean breeze. We spent our days exploring Helen, dragging us to galleries, Diane insisting on ghost tours that made us laugh more than shiver. I loved the mornings best walking barefoot along the shore, the waves lapping at my feet. One day, Ruth joined me, her silver hair glowing in the sunrise. "Clara," she said, "you're different here. Lighter." I smiled, digging my toes into the sand. She was right. I felt unburdened not just by the trust fund or the family drama, but by the weight of who I'd thought I had to be. We talked late into the nights, the six of us sprawled across the cottage's living room, wine glasses in hand. We shared stories we'd never told at book club: Ruth's first love, a sailor who never came back; Helen's secret dream of being a pilot; Diane's regret over a fight with her sister that never healed. I told them about Emily's letter, the meeting Lily's tiny hand. They listened, their faces soft in the lamplight, and offered no advice, just presence. "You'll know what to do," Clara Ruth set her hand on mine. "You always do." Her faith in me felt like a gift, one I was learning to give myself. Back home, I carried that lightness with me. I threw myself into my classes, teaching knitting with a new energy, encouraging my students to try bold patterns, to make mistakes, and laugh. The storytelling workshop grew too, drawing a few new faces, including a young woman named Sarah, who worked at the center and wanted to learn from us elders, as she called us with a grin. I started recording our stories with their permission, using a little recorder Susan lent me. The idea was to create a podcast, something the center could share online. It was daunting, technology wasn't my strength, but Sarah helped, and the process felt like planting a seed for the future. I also made a big decision. I put my house on the market. It wasn't impulsive. I'd been thinking about it since visiting that condo, imagining a smaller, simpler life. The house held so many memories: Tom's laughter, Michael's childhood, our family dinners. But it also held the weight of loss, of being left behind. I wanted a fresh start, not to erase the past, but to make room for the present. David connected me with a realtor, and we priced it modestly enough to buy a condo and have some savings left. When the for sale sign went up, I felt a pang, but also a thrill. I was choosing my future. Sorting through the house was emotional. I kept what mattered: the locket, my mother's quilt, Tom's records, a few of Michael's childhood drawings. The rest I donated or sold, each item a small letting go. I found a letter Tom had written me before we married, tucked in an old book. "Clara," he wrote, "you're my home, no matter where we are." I cried reading it, not out of sadness, but because I realized I was becoming my own home now. I framed the letter a reminder of love that didn't demand my erasure. Emily called again a few weeks after our meeting. Her voice was tentative, asking if I'd like to see Lily, maybe visit their house. I hesitated, then suggested the cafe again. I wasn't ready for their space, their rules. She agreed, and we met on a crisp morning. Lily awake this time, her eyes wide and curious. Emily was quieter, less polished, as if motherhood had softened her edges. We talked about small things: Lily's sleep, the weather, my knitting classes. She didn't push for more, and I didn't offer. But when I held Lily, her warmth against my chest, I felt a love that wasn't tied to Emily or Michael, just to her. I sang her a lullaby my mother used to sing, and Emily watched, her eyes wet. "You're good with her," she said. I nodded, handing Lily back, and left without promising anything. That moment stayed with me, not as a pull to reconcile, but as a reminder that love could exist without surrender. I started knitting a new blanket for Lily, soft pink with tiny flowers, not because I owed it to them, but because it felt right. I didn't tell Emily or send it yet. It was for me, for the grandmother I was, whether they saw me or not. The house sold faster than I expected to a young couple with a toddler. I watched them walk through it, imagining their own memories, filling the rooms, and felt at peace. I bought the condo I'd visited, the one with the park view, and moved in with Ruth's help. It was small but bright, with a balcony where I could grow herbs. I hung my paintings, set up a corner for knitting, and placed Tom's letter on the wall. The first night I sat on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand, and felt a joy so pure it startled me. This was mine, my space, my life. I kept teaching, kept storytelling, kept growing. The podcast launched just a few episodes at first, but it spread, reaching people beyond our town. I got letters from women who'd heard it saying, "My stories. Our stories made them feel less alone. One wrote, "Clara, you reminded me I'm still here, still worth something." I read it at book club, my voice breaking, and we all cried, then laughed because that's what we did, held each other's pain and joy. I saw Emily and Lily a few more times, always at the cafe, always on my terms. Michael joined once his apology, quieter but sincere. They didn't ask for the trust fund again, and I didn't bring it up. We were cautious like strangers learning to trust. I gave Emily the blanket for Lily, and she held it like it was fragile, saying, "Thank you, Clara. It's beautiful." I nodded, my heart full but guarded. I love them, but I love myself too, and that balance was new, precious. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, the locket warm against my skin, I wrote in my journal, "I am Clara, and I am whole." I looked out at the park, the trees swaying in the breeze, and felt my mother's strength. Tom's love, my own resilience. I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I'd saved myself. The condo became my sanctuary, a place where every corner reflected who I was becoming. The balcony with its pots of thyme and rosemary caught the morning sun, and I'd sit there with my coffee watching the park come alive. The walls held my paintings, my mother's quilt draped over the couch, and Tom's letter hung where I could see it daily. I'd never lived alone before, not truly. There was always Tom, then Michael, then the expectation of family filling the space. Now it was just me, and I found I liked it. Not the loneliness I'd feared, but a quiet fullness, a life shaped by my own hands. The storytelling workshop had grown into something I hadn't expected. What started as a small group was now a community with new faces joining each month. Sarah, the young woman from the center, had turned our recordings into a podcast that was gaining listeners not just locally, but across the country. I'd get emails from women, some my age, some younger, saying our stories gave them courage, made them feel seen. One wrote, "Clara, I was ready to give up after my kids moved away, but hearing you talk about your life made me want to keep going." I read that email to the group, my voice catching, and George reached over his hand, steady on mine. We were building something not just for ourselves, but for others, and it felt like a legacy. I kept teaching knitting too. The class is now so popular that Susan added a second session. My students were my joy Margaret with her endless questions, Lila with her quick wit, Joan who'd finally mastered a cable stitch and beamed like she'd won a prize. I started bringing them to the storytelling sessions, blending the two groups, and the room buzzed with laughter and tears. One day, Susan pulled me aside. "Clara," she said, "you've changed this place. We're thinking of naming a program after you, the Clara Project for Senior Storytelling and Crafts." I laughed, embarrassed, but my heart swelled. I told her I'd think about it, but inside I was honored not just for the recognition, but for the proof that I mattered. My life felt full, but Emily and Michael were still a quiet undercurrent. We'd met a few times since that first cafe meeting, always with Lily, always on neutral ground. They were trying, I could see that. Emily was softer, less polished. Her apologies, more genuine each time. Michael was quieter, his guilt, heavy, but unspoken. I held Lily when we met, sang to her, knitted her tiny hats, but I kept my distance emotionally. I wasn't ready to trust them fully, not after the baby shower, the silence, the way they'd made me feel invisible. But I loved Lily, and that love was a bridge, small, but real. One afternoon, I got a call from David, my lawyer. He'd received a request from Emily's attorney asking for details about the trust fund's dissolution. It wasn't a lawsuit, just a formal inquiry, but it stirred something in me, not fear, but a need to close that chapter for good. I asked David to meet me, and we sat in his office, the same one where I'd made the decision to redirect the money. He showed me the letter, professional, but pointed, asking if the funds could be reinstated or if there was a misunderstanding. "Clara," David said, "you're under no obligation to respond. The trust is gone legally and irrevocably, but they're pushing. What do you want to do?" I thought about it for days. I didn't owe them an explanation, but I wanted them to understand not just the decision, but why it mattered. I asked David to draft a response not to Emily's attorney, but to Emily and Michael directly. I wrote it myself, every word deliberate, and David made it official. The letter was simple but clear. The trust fund was my life savings, a gift I'd given out of love, but love didn't mean ownership. Their actions banning me from the baby shower, sidelining me, had shown me I wasn't valued, and I'd chosen to value myself instead. The money was now with Silver Years helping women who'd been overlooked just as I had. I ended with, I wish you well, but my choices are mine, as yours are yours. I didn't send it right away. I sat with it, reading it over, making sure it was true to me. It wasn't angry or vengeful, just honest. I wanted them to know I wasn't invisible, that my worth wasn't tied to their approval. When I gave it to David to mail, I felt a release, like setting down a weight I'd carried too long. I didn't expect a response, and for weeks I didn't get one. Life went on: my classes, my podcast, my balcony garden, my book club, women planning a winter trip to Savannah. Then came the day of the community center's annual gala, a fundraiser for all its programs, including Silver Years. Susan had asked me to speak to share my story and talk about the podcast. I was nervous, but agreed, wanting to honor the women whose stories we'd told. The gala was held in a local hotel, the ballroom decorated with twinkling lights and flowers. I wore a deep green dress, the locket shining against it, and stood with Ruth, Helen, and the others, feeling their strength beside me. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, my heart pounding. The room was full, hundreds of people, including some of my students, George, Sarah, and even Evelyn, the woman I'd met at the Silver Years event. I took a breath and started not with a script, but from the heart. I told them about my mother, her locket, her lessons about holding your own heart. I told them about losing Tom, raising Michael, loving Emily like a daughter. And then I told them about the baby shower, the moment I was told I'd embarrass them, the silence that followed. I didn't name Emily or Michael, but I didn't need to. The room was quiet, their eyes on me, feeling every word. I talked about the trust fund, how it was my life's work, a gift I'd given freely, and how I'd taken it back, not out of spite, but to honor myself. I told them about Silver Years, the women it helped, the lives it changed. And I ended with the podcast, the stories we shared, the way they reminded us we were never too old to matter. Your worth. I said, my voice steady, isn't in who accepts you, but in how you choose to see yourself. The room erupted in applause, and I stepped down, tears in my eyes, Ruth's arms around me. What I didn't know was that Emily and Michael were there. I saw them later, standing near the back Lily in a stroller. Emily's face was pale, Michael's eyes red. They'd heard every word, and I realized the letter I'd sent had led them here to see the truth in public, to face what they'd done. I didn't approach them, and they didn't approach me. But Emily caught my eye, and for a moment we held each other's gaze. There was no anger, just understanding, raw and unspoken. They left before the event ended, and I let them go. That night, I sat on my balcony, the locket in my hand, and felt a shift. The trust fund, the letter, the gala, they weren't revenge, but a reclamation. I'd shown them and myself that I was more than their rejection. I was Clara, with a life full of love, purpose, and stories, and that was enough. The gala marked a turning point, not because Emily and Michael were there, but because I'd stood in front of a room full of people and claimed my story. I'd spoken my truth, not to shame them, but to honor myself, and that act felt like a door, closing on the woman I'd been always giving, always waiting, always hoping for love that came with conditions. The woman I was, now the one who wore her mother's locket and taught stories and knitted blankets for a granddaughter she loved from a distance, was enough. More than enough. She was whole. Life settled into a rhythm that felt like a gift. My condo was home now, its small spaces filled with pieces of me. My herbs on the balcony, my paintings on the walls, the soft hum of Tom's records on quiet evenings. I'd wake early, make coffee, and sit outside watching the park wake up the joggers and dog walkers weaving through the morning mist. I'd think about my mother, her strength, and Tom, his laughter, and I'd feel them with me, not as ghosts, but as part of the woman I'd become. The locket stayed around my neck, a steady weight, a reminder that my heart was my own. The Clara Project launched at the community center a program blending storytelling and crafts, named after me in a way that still made me blush. I led it with Sarah's help teaching knitting, one-day stories the next, watching people, mostly women my age, but some younger, some men, find their voices. George was a regular, his stories about his wife now joined by new ones about fishing with his grandson. Rose sang more often, her voice stronger each time. The podcast grew too, with listeners sending letters from places I'd never been: Ohio, Oregon, even a small town in Canada. Clara one wrote, "Your voice feels like my mother's telling me I'm still here." I kept that letter on my desk, a reminder of why I kept going. I saw Emily and Michael a few times after the gala, always at the cafe, always with Lily. They didn't mention the trust fund or the letter I'd sent, and I didn't bring them up. Our conversations were careful, like walking on new ice, but they were honest. Emily shared stories about Lily, her first words, her love of music. Michael talked about his job, his hopes for their family. I listened, smiled, held Lily when she reached for me, but I kept my guard up not out of anger, but because I'd learned to protect myself. I gave Lily the tiny hats I'd knitted, a blanket with her name stitched in blue, and Emily's eyes softened each time her thank you, quiet but real. I loved Lily fiercely, but my love for her didn't mean I had to surrender to her parents. I was finding a way to be a grandmother on my own terms. One spring morning, I got a call from Ruth. She was planning a book club picnic in the park, just us 6 women, to celebrate the anniversary of our first meeting. "Clara," she said, "you're the guest of honor. Don't argue." I laughed, knowing better than to fight her. The picnic was perfect blankets spread under a big oak, baskets of sandwiches and lemonade, the air warm with the promise of summer. We talked and laughed, our stories spilling over each other, our voices a chorus of survival and joy. Helen gave me a painting she'd made, a garden bursting with color. "Because it's you," she said. Diane handed me a bracelet she'd woven, simple but strong. I cried, not because I was sad, but because I was loved, not by a family that had to be convinced, but by women who chose me. That evening I walked home, the painting under my arm, the bracelet on my wrist, and felt a peace so deep it was almost sacred. I thought about Emily and Michael, about the trust fund, about the baby shower that had broken me open. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them ill. I hoped they'd find their way just as I'd found mine. But their journey wasn't my responsibility anymore. Mine was to live fully and freely for as long as I had. I started a new ritual after the picnic. Every Sunday I'd go to the park with a small candle, one I'd bought just for this. I'd light it, sit on a bench, and think about the women I'd met through silver years, through the center, through my life. I'd think about my mother, her locket, her lessons. I'd think about Tom, his love, his belief in me. And I'd think about myself, the Clara who'd been invisible, and the Clara who was now seen, not by others, but by her own heart. The candle was my way of honoring us all, a small flame against the dark. One day I decided to pass the locket on. Not to Emily or Michael, not even to Lily, not yet. I gave it to Sarah, the young woman who'd helped with the podcast, who'd listened to our stories with a heart so open it reminded me of my mother. I told her its story, my mother's strength, my own journey, and said, "This is for you to carry forward." She cried, hugging me, and promised to wear it with pride. I felt no loss giving it away. Its lessons were in me, and I was ready to let it light someone else's path. I kept the condo, the classes, the podcast, the book club. I traveled with the women again to Savannah, then to a little town in Maine, each trip a reminder that the world was still mine to explore. I painted, knitted, wrote in my journal, lived. and I saw Lily grow her laughter, a joy I held lightly, knowing it was enough to love her without needing to fix her parents. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, the stars bright above, I wrote my final journal entry for that chapter of my life. I am Clara, and I am at peace. I closed the book, set it on the table, and looked out at the park, the trees swaying in the breeze. I lit a candle not for anyone else but for me, its flame steady and warm. I thought of my mother's words, of Tom's love of the women who'd carried me through. And I thought of you, whoever you are listening to this story, maybe feeling invisible, maybe wondering if you're enough, if your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. Light a candle, plant a seed. Tell your story. You are here, and you are enough.